And I think we are now live on Facebook. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to today's session. Today, we have a very special guest, a very famous historian, an icon for all of us, an inspiration for a whole generation of historians, Professor Himanshu Prabha Ray, ma'am. Professor Ray is former chairman of the National Monuments Authority, Ministry of Culture, and former professor, Center for Historical Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. She has been also the editor of Archaeology and Religion in South Asia in the Routledge series. Her books on maritime history include Beyond Trade, Cultural Roots of India's Ocean, which was published by Aryan Book International in 2015, The Archaeology of Seafaring in Ancient South Asia, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2003, and also edited volumes including Satish Chandra and Himanshu Prabhare, The Sea, Identity and History, From the Bay of Bengal to the South China Sea, published by Manohar Publication in 2013. HP Ray and EAL First Cross Currents and Community Networks, encapsulating the history of the Indian Ocean World, published by the Oxford University Press in 2017 in New Delhi. H.P. Ray and J.F. Sells, Tradition and Archaeology, Early Maritime Context in the Indian Ocean, published by Manohar Publishers in 1996. Updated edition came in 2012. And her most recent work was Archaeology and Buddhism in South Asia, published by Routledge in 2018. So, without further ado, I would request Professor Ray to begin with the lecture. I'm just sharing the screen. I hope it is visible to all of us. Over to you, ma'am, and thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
I'm not sure. Hello, good evening. I'm not sure if anybody can hear me.
You are audible, ma'am.
Uh, I'm uh, I'm really honored to be here. Ishan, can you let me know if I can be heard? Thanks, Lars, for letting me know that I can be heard. I think there was some problem, and that's why I was a little worried. So do let me know if my voice tapers off or if I need to repeat anything. I'm really honored to be here and to be giving this lecture. This comes from a long time spent teaching students. Many of you are here, and I'm really delighted and pleased to see you. And of course, doing my own research. I'm very grateful for being invited here. What I thought I would do today is to talk about the spread of Buddhism, but through archaeology. And when I talk about archaeology, I'm really looking at the 19th and 20th century. Because archaeology, as you know, is a comparatively recent discipline. It is a discipline which came to India in the 19th century with the setting up of the Archaeological Survey of India in 1861. And also, it is a discipline which then helped uncover a great deal of the Buddhism and the Buddhist sites that we see or study about today. So, in a way, what we are doing today and what we are going to do today is to look at the 19th and 20th century prism through which we will then focus our attention to Buddhism. So, I start with this painting. And this is a painting by the famous painter Nandalal Bose. It is a painting which was done in the Constitution. As you know, the Constitution of India has paintings which draw on history and archaeology. And many of these paintings, in fact, quite a number of them, draw on Buddhism. So this is a document which in a way lays the foundation of independent India. And it is significant and interesting that this document should portray in such a big way Buddhism and the archaeology of Buddhism. So my starting point then is the Constitution of India and the paintings made by Nandalal Bose. Now, if you see this painting, this shows Nalanda. In the background, you can see the buildings. And you can see the Chaitya arches of the buildings. And in the foreground, what one sees are monks very prominently depicted. So my question then is, we need to bear in mind this focus or this emphasis on Buddhist monks. And I will come back to that in a little while, further down in my talk. But I want you to remember that, this is something which starts with the Constitution of India and in a way lays the foundation of independent India. Next slide, please. So my question then is, the Constitution of India is a political document. Why do we have paintings relating to history and archaeology in what is essentially a political document? And how do we interpret them? How do we understand them? Why did they come about? So there are a whole lot of questions which come to mind. Some of these I have discussed, but I have stopped at 1947. Some of these I've discussed in my book, The Return of the Buddha. But there's much more work to be done in order to understand what this means for our present. So the reason why these paintings were included, and if you look at the debates of the debates of when the Constitution was adopted, several of our leaders, they argued that these paintings provided a cultural context and would then be, and this cultural context was would be one of the guiding principles of independent India. They also argued that these paintings restored the balance between the past and the present. So it's interesting that the Constitution, while it lays the foundation for the present and the future, also draws on the past and highlights some of the important facets of this past, which we need to bear in mind. I think it's also important to understand and to accept and to realize that Buddhism itself was, after all, a discovery of Victorian England in the 19th century. And it is through archaeology that many of the leading archaeologists brought some of their thoughts with reference to Buddhism to India. Next slide, please. So who were these archaeologists who came to India and who worked in India? I think there's also a distinction that needs to be drawn between the 19th century and the 20th century. So the 19th and 20th are not in continuation, and I think this is an important point. One needs to think of the 19th separately from the 20th, because the developments are very different at the beginning of the 20th, starting 1901, 1902 onwards. In the 19th century, when the first surveys took place, many of the people who were involved in these surveys were military officials and surveyors. They were not archaeologists, they were not trained people. Some of the names, this is not a comprehensive list, but this is only the list which I thought we could talk about today, or some of these we could talk about today, because their methodologies are very different. You cannot put them all in one bag, and their methodologies were very different and varied from one to the other. So for example, if you look at Colin Mackenzie, he's the one who surveyed and excavated at Amaravati in Andhra, but he was largely a collector and a surveyor. He did not excavate, he did not dig into stupas. What he was doing was making drawings of various sites. He was also collecting manuscripts, and he used many of his Indian pundits, as he called them, or Indian helpers in the process, and many of them helped him making these collections. Much of this material is in the British Museum today, and a lot of work has been done on this. There have been publications on Mackenzie's drawings, and they are really interesting. Jennifer House has worked on it, and they're really interesting because they provide insights into the kind of material that Mackenzie collected. In contrast to Mackenzie, Sanchi, for example, was dug into first by Captain Fell, then by Cunningham. when I say dug into, what I mean is that the methodology that was adopted should one say, doing the archaeology of Buddhist stoops was to dig a trench from the top into the bottom and right through the stoop. I'll show you in a moment what that means. So that was the methodology that was adopted by Captain Fell at Sanchi, and as a result, some of the stoops were destroyed at Sanchi as a result of these early archaeological adventurers. Maharaja Ranjit Singh's French mercenaries, Ventura, for example, he had employed several Europeans to train his troops because he wanted to really bring his army to modernize his army. And many of these French mercenaries who came and joined Maharaja Ranjit Singh had worked in Egypt and had been involved in many of the excavations in Egypt. So they knew about archaeology. But the interesting point is that when they came to India, many of them were looking not for Buddhism, but they were looking for the Greeks, and they were looking for Alexander. Because as you would know, that's what was part of the European tradition, and that's what the European mercenaries of Maharaja Ranjit Singh were looking for. And it was as part of that search for the Greeks that Ventura discovered Manikyala, because Manikyala was known as, in local legend and amongst the local people, as the place where Alexander's horse was buried. So he was not looking for the Buddha or the stupa or anything like that. What he was looking for was Alexander's horse, and he was looking for the Greeks. Now, as compared to these, Alexander Cunningham, as you know, and all of you know that, 1861 set up the Archaeological Survey of India, because he argued that the Purans and the Sanskrit texts do not inform us about Buddhism, and it is only through archaeology that we can study Buddhism. Now, there's a lot that has been written on Alexander Cunningham, including by Professor Rupinder Singh, so I will not talk too much about Alexander Cunningham, but I will start my discussion with Manikyala and with the excavations at Manikyala. Manikyala today is in Pakistan. Next slide, please. And is a site which is one of the early ones excavated in 1830. I am not sure because I cannot see the screen anymore. Anyway, the stoop that you see on the site, on the slide, is a stoop which was set up, which is after conservation. This is not the original. The site itself is near Islamabad. It is one of the major sites for Gandharan Buddhism, as you can imagine, the trench was dug from the top into the inner part of the stupa. The stupa itself, as we know it today, dates from 2nd century BCE to the 8th century CE. Next slide, please. Much of the material from the stoop at Manikyala is in the British Museum. And this slide shows you the excavations into the relic chamber, that a shaft was dug into the stoop from the top into the center. And it was in the center and the inner part of the stoop that several reliquaries, relics, other coins. Next slide, please. Coins and gems, all these were found. And this is really the work of Elizabeth Errington and many of the researchers at the British Museum who have very carefully gone through the reports of Ventura's work. They have also looked at the collection that they have. They've tallied it all together. So after a lot of hard work, this diagram has been produced, which shows you how the internal deposits inside the stoop were made. Now, what is quite interesting is that coins were placed at regular intervals, And this raises, of course, the whole question of why were coins placed inside the stup, because you do get variations in what was placed inside the stup. And certainly in the northwest, in the Gandharan area, in what is today Pakistan, there are several sites where coins have been found, including the coins which show the Buddha image. I have not put it together in this slideshow, but there is a very beautiful gold coin of the Kushan period, which shows the Buddha image and the legend Bodo in Greek. So certainly the coins were one of the major items which were deposited inside. Is it better now? Okay. So the reliquaries that you see on the top right-hand corner, one finds that many of these today are in either in museums or have been re-enshrined. And that's again another story about what happens to the objects that were found inside stups. So one part of the story is the excavations, the various ways in which the methodologies that were adopted to look at the Buddhist monuments, at the monastic sites. And the other part of the story is what happened to the coins and to the other deposits that were found inside. Next slide, please. Now, there was, again, I have said this earlier, that you have to make a distinction between 19th century and the 20th century. And there is variation. There is no one pattern. You have to look at the sites separately. So, for example, the reliquaries that came from Sanchi, Sopara, Girnar went to museums. Not to the same museum, they went to different museums. The Sanchi reliquaries and relic deposits are in the British Museum. Some of them were returned and were re-enshrined in Sanchi. So that's another story of Sanchi and where the relics went and how they came back. And, you know, they came back after independence and how they were re-enshrined. Girnar relics are in the Rajkot Museum. Sopara are in Mumbai in the Asiatic Society Museum. But what is quite interesting is that some of these reliquaries, 1897, particularly the reliquary from Piprava, that was gifted to the Thais because the British considered Thais or Siam as the only inheritor of Buddhism in the modern period. And a stup has been set up where this was re-enshrined in Bangkok. A second one from Shaji Ki Dheri was given to Burma, to the Burmese in 1908-9, and that again has been re-enshrined in a stup in Mandalay. But increasingly from the last part or the latter part of the 19th century and early part of the 20th century, a lot of voices were raised in India saying that, you know, these were important and sacred objects, sacred deposits, and these could not be sent outside India. And increasingly, the Mahabodhi Society and members of the Mahabodhi Society raised questions about these reliquaries being sent outside the country. And so as a result, many of these were re-enshrined within the country. And a good example is from the site of Bhattiprolu. I'll talk more about the site of Bhattiprolu in coastal Andhra on the river Krishna in a moment. But the reliquary from Bhattiprolu was re-enshrined in a new temple that was built in Calcutta, the Sri Dharmarajika Vihara. Next slide, please. So the point is that we need to make this distinction about what happens to the relics and reliquaries in the 19th and 20th century. And again, what comes into focus is this new temple. And this new temple was built at Sarnath and the Mulagandha Kuti. It was a temple into which not just the Mahabodhi Society and Anagarik Dharmapal, they contributed, but also many American donors contributed to the building of this temple. And the reliquaries found in the stoop at Mirpur Khas in Sindh, which was excavated in 1910 by Cousins, was re-enshrined in this temple. And what I find both surprising and kind of distressing is that this temple was built at an archaeological site of Sarnath. So it was a new temple built at a site which is a very rich site, and which is the site of Sarnath. Next slide, please. And this site, the site of Sarnath, as you know, is the site where the Buddha gave his first sermon. And you can see the Mulagandha Kuti in the background, the excavated remains and the conserved remains in the foreground. On the right-hand side, you see the new Jain temple. This is a temple which came up, which has ancient roots, but is a modern temple again. And in the middle, you see the large the stoop that is there at the site. Sarnath is critical both as a Buddhist site, but also as a site which is close to Varanasi, which, as you know, is also sacred to the Hindus. And the Jain temple already shows the multi-religious landscape of the area. Next slide, please. Sarnath is also interesting because Sarnath is the place where the lion pillar capital was found, which is now the national symbol of India and figures prominently in the Constitution of India. So, summing up these kind of early interventions and summing up what I have just discussed about what was being done in the 19th and 20th century, let me highlight a few points. Now, if you look at the archaeological evidence, what becomes very clear is that the archaeological evidence dates to at least 2 to 3 centuries after the parinirvana of the Buddha, after the dates for the historical Buddha, which are 6th, 5th century BCE. And the archaeological indicators, which are inscriptions, stoops, images, come up really in the 3rd, 2nd centuries BCE. The earliest inscriptions are, of course, of Mauryan King Ashok, the Dhammalipi, which are in a variety of scripts, Brahmi, Kharoshti, Greek, and Aramaic, and have been found extensively over across the subcontinent. And of course, Ashok plays an important role, not just because his inscriptions are the earliest evidence that we have for the earliest archaeological evidence for Buddhism, but also because Buddhist writings, they talk about how Ashok sent emissaries to Sri Lanka and to Suvarnabhumi for preaching the Dhamma. But I think what is missed in all of this is the distinction that is very clear from the archaeological evidence between asceticism and monasticism. So asceticism, Buddhism, as you know, was an ascetic tradition. It was a very ancient, asceticism has been a very ancient tradition of India. And Buddhism was one of the offshoots which takes up this tradition and converts it into monasticism. That is the setting up of monastic complexes, the rainy season settlement in one area. So the distinction then has to be made in what changed when Buddhism arose in the 6th, 5th centuries BCE, and when the monastic complexes first appeared in the 3rd, 2nd centuries BCE. And I think this distinction needs to be researched much more, not just in terms of the variations across the country, but also what it means for various aspects of Buddhism that we study. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Now, another aspect of monasticism, and another aspect which monasticism brings out, is the diversity. The fact that not all previous slide, please. That not all Buddhist sites are the same, and yeah, thanks. And this becomes very clear from the new work that has been done based on the inscriptions of Ashok. This is a map that is familiar to all of you. I just want to point out two aspects. We all read and look at Ashokan inscriptions, but when you look at the context of the Ashokan inscriptions, that context varies across the subcontinent. So the red circle that you see at the bottom, which are the minor rock edicts, which are the earliest, are very different, both in in the way they are written, also the text that they contain, as compared to the pillar edicts that you see in the Ganga Valley, which is the black circle that is highlighted with that red arrow. Now, the new research also shows that there is linguistic variation. It's not just that they look different or they are on pillars or on rocks, but particularly Oscar von Hinüber's work discusses the fact that there are linguistic variations between these. And he argues that many of the Buddhist lineages and the Buddhist priests and monastics were using language differently in different parts of the subcontinent. Next slide, please. Ashok, of course, has a tremendous longevity in terms of his memory, which survives almost to the present. I've mentioned that his lion capital is our national symbol, but also the fact that in the 14th century, the Ashokan pillar was moved to Delhi. And of course, the other important aspect is that many of the later rulers, they inscribed their own inscriptions on the same pillars on which Ashok had engraved his edicts. So his historical memory has been with us almost to the present. Next slide, please. This has to do both with the fact that Buddhist history, and particularly the history of many countries, especially Sri Lanka is a good example. It refers to the emissaries sent by King Ashok. But if we look at the agency for the spread of Buddhism, we find that there is no uniformity in the different sources that we get. Certainly Buddhist history and the fact that the early archaeologists such as Cunningham emphasized the importance of the Mauryan ruler. But if you look at the inscriptions, one gets a very different picture. The inscriptions record the role of learned monks and nuns. And Gregory Chopin has written about it. And there's a lot of evidence from inscriptions that it was the monks and nuns who set up stupas and also who started relic worship. So there is the significance given to the monks and nuns. There's also the fact that merchants are seen as patrons, and these merchants, they set up, or they donated for the setting up of religious shrines. And a good example is Anathapindaka, and this I'll show you the sculpture in a moment. There's sculptures that you can see at several Buddhist sites where merchants are celebrated. But of course, historians, and there's several who have written on the ancient history, they talk about the fact that it was urban centers which provided sustenance for the spread of Buddhism. So there's no one uniform model that we can follow, or one uniform agency that we can attribute for the spread of Buddhism. Next slide, please. This is a more than life-size image, which is in the Sarnath Museum. It's an image of Bhikshu Bala, dated to the 3rd year of Kanishka, 2nd century CE. It's a 10 feet high image, and it has an inscription, and that is how we are able to date it. And also that is how we are able to see the influence, or the prominent role played by the Bhikshu in not just transporting this image, which is made in the Mathura style, to Sarnath, but also setting up the chhatra and also inscribing it. And this, as I said, is now in the museum at Sarnath. Next slide, please. Let us look at merchants as patrons. I talked about Anathapindaka and how he bought Jetavana and then he presented it to the Sangha. But there's also the story of Tapusa and Bhallika, and they traveled from Ukkala or Orissa, and they brought the relics back with them, and they set up early stoops in Orissa. And they are also credited with the setting up of monastic complexes. Next slide, please. So we have we've looked at merchants, we've looked at monks and nuns. Next slide, please. This is the purchase of Jetavana, which is depicted very prominently at Bharod. It's on a pillar. It's a roundel on the pillar, and it is now in the Indian Museum in Kolkata. And in the slide, you can see the merchant spreading out gold coins on the ground, because he was Prince Jeta said that he would only sell Jetavana if it was paid for by gold coins being spread out on the area. And then on the left-hand side, you see the merchant with the kamandalu making the gift. Next slide, please. So certainly the generosity of merchants was very prominently depicted in Buddhist sites, and at several of these Buddhist railings. Let us move to another area, which shows a very different orientation of Buddhist sites, and this is the Andhra coast. There is a fragmentary Ashokan inscription from Amravati. The arrow shows you where Amravati is. It is one of the longest surviving sites on the Andhra coast. There are a large number of sites, almost 140 of them. Lars Forgelin has done work at some of the sites, Totlakonda and Bavikonda in Andhra. There's also work done by Akira Shimada on the sites in Andhra Pradesh. But what is significant are two things. One is, if you look at the red dots, you find that between 2nd century BCE and 3rd century CE, most of these are on the coast, starting from Kalingapatnam up north, right down to to the south. And the red dots are very prominent on the coast. Amaravati, of course, I said, is the longest surviving site, well into the 14th century CE. But also Nagarjun Konda, which is further in on the Krishna, is a multi-religious site. And starting from the prehistoric period, megaliths, it has everything, Hindu, Jain, Buddhist, all structures and monuments. But that's another story. But let's look at the maritime orientation of Andhra, and also let's consider who were the agents who then led to the spread of Buddhism along the Andhra coast. Next slide, please. And it is here then that when we look closely, that the site of Bhattiprolu becomes quite significant. This is the Buddhist mound at Bhattiprolu. And often the Andhra sites are not discussed in terms of the spread of the cult of relics, because it's often assumed that it was only in the Gandharan area that relics and reliquaries were enshrined in stupas. But that is not quite correct. And as this map shows, you see several coastal sites from which you get relics and reliquaries. And the most important, of course, is Bhattiprolu, which is an early site excavated in the 19th century. Next slide, please. And the excavations have revealed a very elaborate structure for the enshrinement of the relics. The site was discovered in 1870, and excavations were done in 1892. And it is this 1892 excavations which yielded inscribed relic caskets, relics of the Buddha, jewels. And these inscriptions are also some of the earliest inscriptions in southern Brahmi. And hence the site of Bhattiprolu, even though it's a 19th century excavation, has several important and significant results for our discussion. Next slide, please. The excavations, and this again shows you from I.K. Sarma's book, it shows you how the relic containers were placed inside the stup, the fact that they were kept at different levels, which is also something which we saw from the Manikyala stup, and the fact that inside these stone relic containers, there were other nestled within those granite stone relic containers. There were smaller reliquaries, there were pearls, beads, and so on. Next slide, please. So what we have are that these stone relic containers had inscriptions. And these inscriptions inform us about who are the people who participated in the enshrinement of these relics. The inscriptions refer to Raja Kubirak, who was a local Raja. It refers to a Nigama or a market town, and a Goshti or assembly, and members of these who all donated and were present at the enshrinement of the relics. And of course, they mention that these relics were those of the Buddha. Next slide, please. Now, when these relics were placed inside the stup, the silver punch mark coins were arranged in the form of a swastika, and this was at the base of relic container number 3. You can see on the right-hand side, you can see the inscriptions on the granite container, and the inscriptions are all around the mouth of the container, and it is inside this that the relics and other objects were placed. So what is also quite evident is the elaborate ceremony, not just that many people participated in this relic enshrinement, the laity as well as the monks and nuns, but also the fact that this was a major public event. And the inscriptions really record the public proclamation that was made. Relics were taken in procession, worshippers thronged the ceremony, and the inscriptions were read out during festivities. So this was a very important occasion. And it's quite interesting when you read the re-enshrinement of the relics that happened in the late 19th, early 20th century at the Mulagandhakuti in Sarnath, which I talked about earlier, that there again, the relics were taken out in procession, that major public figures contributed. So it was a reenactment of an earlier event or an earlier ceremony that we know from the inscriptions and that we know happened as early as the 2nd, 1st century BCE. Next slide, please. What is also important about the inscriptions is that these often are associated, or writing is very often associated with the spread of Buddhism. And the quote is from Peter Skilling, who's done a lot of work on early Buddhism, where he says that wherever Buddhism traveled, it fostered intimate associations with the written word. And the stone bowl that you see on your screen that has the inscription on the rim, it is from Kokrakot in Rohtak. But there's also the terracotta, which is a very beautiful, though broken terracotta, which is now in the National Museum, which shows you the writing of alphabets on a wooden tablet. And in the Gandharan period, there is an image of the boy Buddha Siddhartha writing on a wooden tablet. So Buddhism is scholars have associated Buddhism with the spread of writing, and this shows up in many of our archaeological sites. Next slide, please. The other thing that shows up at Andhra is the close association between Andhra and not just Sri Lanka, but also several other regions. And this is particularly evident at Nagarjun Konda, which had a Sinhala monastic unit for monks from Sri Lanka. But there are also inscriptions which record that the donations were made for the monks of Sri Lanka. That the donation is for the monks of Sri Lanka who spread Buddhism to different parts of the subcontinent, whether it was Kashmir, Gandhar, they talk about China, Vanavasi, and different areas. And many of these place names correspond with the Sri Lankan chronicles of the 5th century, the Mahavansa. Next slide, please. This takes me to look at some of the new evidence, the new archaeological research from Sri Lanka, which I think is quite significant, and I think which researchers in India should really take into account. And this evidence comes from the joint German Sri Lankan team, which excavated at the site of Tissa Maharama. I'll show you the site in a moment on a map. It's on the south coast of Sri Lanka, dates from 5th century BCE to 12th century CE. It's quite a fascinating site because it's, though the site itself is a settlement site, it is close or situated in the vicinity of one of the ancient river temples in the area associated with the ancient Ruhuna. It is also supposed to be the landing place of Prince Vijaya, who took, according to Mahavansa, which is much later, which took Buddhism, or who took Buddhism to Sri Lanka. There's also an ancient water tank. But more importantly, and this is for many of you who look at the archaeological data and look at pottery, there is a very detailed analysis of rouletted ware from the site. Rouletted ware has a whole history, which I don't think I have time to go into now, but it's a fascinating history, starting from Wheeler's excavation at Arikamedu to the fact that today it's found all the way along the east coast from Bengal to Sri Lanka, and finally to the fact that it's now dated 3rd, 2nd to 1st century BCE. And you also have inscribed related ware from Tissa Maharama, where names of monks and nuns, and I would emphasize nuns, appear very prominently on related ware. But that's another story. I don't want to go into that story now. Next slide, please. What is interesting about that part of the Sri Lankan coast, and here you see on your map, you see the site of Tissa Maharama, but you also have marked on your map the Godwaya shipwreck site. This is one of the earliest shipwreck sites in South Asian waters. There's a graffito again on a potsherd from Tissa Maharama, and there's a saddle quern which has been found perhaps for grinding medicines. So the point that I'm trying to make is that we need to not just look at the spread of Buddhism across India, the Indian subcontinent, but also across the waters. And the earliest evidence that we have for the spread of Buddhism along the coastal route, along the maritime route, from Andhra or along the east coast right down into Sri Lanka, comes both from the Andhra sites, but also from sites such as Tissa Maharama and the shipwreck site at Godwaya. Next slide, please. Godwaya, as I said, is the earliest shipwreck site, 2nd century BCE to 2nd century CE. It's very close to a fishing village. It also carried a cargo of iron ingots, saddle querns, and so on from India. And it is a site which has continued into the 14th century. There's also Persian pottery found, but also fragments of Chinese and Chinese Celadon ware. Next slide, please. So clearly, the spread of Buddhism has been both across land and across waters. And that is the spread of Buddhism into Southeast Asia, as some of you know, is something that I've been working on. And I would really be delighted if more people, some of the people listening on today, would take this forward. Now, I'm now going to gradually come to a conclusion so that we can have some kind of a discussion and also maybe have some question answers. Very briefly, I'd like to point out the fact that while many of the sites that I've talked about today are important, I did not talk about the Ganga Valley because and the sites in the Ganga Valley, because those sites have been discussed and are written about in a lot of literature. I would just like to point out that there are many other sites which never even get talked about. As I say, they fall through the cracks. Starting from Kashmir, sites like Ambaran, Harwan, the fact that the Tabo monastery in Himachal is not just the oldest living monastery, but it's also a living monastery. So it's both oldest and living, and it has a rich collection of both Tibetan and Sanskrit manuscripts. There are sites in the Northeast which we need to research much more. Tripura, Pilak in Tripura, 8th to 12th century, but also in Bangladesh, Paharpur being an important site, and Tamil Nadu never gets to be talked about in terms of Buddhism, particularly places like Kanchipuram, Buddhist monastic sites, 2nd century BCE to 4th century CE. Next slide, please. And one of the sites which is, I think, a great and a very fascinating site is the site of Nagapattinam. At the bottom of your screen, you see but this is a drawing made by Walter Elliott of what he called a Chinese pagoda on the Tamil coast looked like. It doesn't exist anymore. That brick temple and the brick structure was pulled down in the 19th century. And today in its place, I think, is an administrative building. But what is quite significant is that there are inscriptions, there are copper plate inscriptions, which refer to many dynasties making donations to the Chudamani Vihar at Nagapattinam. These were kings from Srivijaya, the Shailendra kings, but also the Cholas, Rajarada I, who made donations to this temple. Next slide, please. And Nagapattinam itself is a fascinating area, and it has both this Buddhist temple, but also Hindu temples there. But what I found quite extraordinary, and again, this is something which needs far more work, is that there are these series of bronze images which come from the area around Nagapattinam. Many of these were found when the Nagapattinam temple was pulled down. And you can see some of these are images which we all know, which we are familiar with. Buddha in the Bhumi Sparsha Mudra, which you see on the top, or in the Abhay Mudra. So these are the usual Buddha images or the Buddha bronzes that we see. But the big one that you see, very close to what one would imagine a Shaiv bronze to look like, but this is a Lokeshwar image. And it is equally important to know and to realize that Buddhism at Nagapattinam continued well into the 16th century. So unlike what Cunningham said, that Buddhism came to an end in the 7th century, or that Buddhism, disappeared from India in the 12th century, if you look at data from sites such as Kanchipuram or Nagapattinam, it is very clear that Buddhism continued well into the 16th century. It changed. There are many variations in it. Nagapattinam itself has many types of Buddhism, but that's something that that all of us need to work on and to research more. Next slide, please. I think my next slide would be the final slide. So in conclusion, what do we conclude about the colonial legacy? I would argue that in terms of some of the stereotypes that were created, we continue to repeat them without investigating them. Example, sites associated with the historical Buddha. Secondly, decline of Buddhism. Some of these. But we also tend to neglect some sources. We highlight inscriptions, but we don't look at inscriptions and reliquaries. And even if we look at inscriptions and reliquaries, we seldom look at the context. We seldom look at where these reliquaries were found. And also the fact that it is not just coins were not just with trade, but coins were also enshrined in monastic sites. The search for the historical Buddha, I would say, is a colonial legacy. Even today, we continue to look at sites or search for sites associated with the historical Buddha and treat Buddhist texts as historical documents. Whereas what I would like to argue is that archaeology is really needs to be looked at in its own right. It's a parallel discipline, and the fact that it provides us many of the insights which we have long ignored, I think should make all of us sit up and do further research. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for this lovely, very enriching lecture that you have presented on Buddhism. I hope I am audible to you. Can you hear me, ma'am? Can you hear me?
I think I have a problem with I can't hear.
Okay, let me just see.
Yeah, I'm having problems hearing you. Okay, sure. Thanks. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
So thank you so much, ma'am, for delivering this amazing lecture on Buddhism in India. And due to some technical issues, Professor Ray cannot hear our voice. So we have to conclude the session now. But we'll surely post your questions to Professor Ray, and she'll get back to you all through email, or we'll record the session and we'll put it out later. Thank you so much, everybody, and this lecture will be available on YouTube and on Facebook, so do check it out. Do subscribe and do share. Thank you and have a great evening.